Okay, so that is what he had to say on Ukraine. Then he got into the bad part of his speech. Okay, that was the best part of his speech. Then he got into the bad part. So he started talking about the pandemic. And this is where the lies begin. Because when you're the president of the United States, and you've had the worst 14 months of any president of the United States ever. I mean, Abraham Lincoln had a full-scale insurrection on his hands in the beginning of his administration. That wasn't caused by Abraham Lincoln. Everything bad that has happened over the last 14 months is a completely self-inflicted wound. Joe Biden is the Kurt Cobain of politics. He put a shotgun in the mouth of the American body politic and then pulled the trigger. And the brains are on the wall.
All right. That was our friend Ben Shapiro, who becoming, I think, the first person in the history of the world to compare Joe Biden to Kurt Cobain.
I mean, I always kind of pictured him more as the Eddie Vedder, to Barack Obama's Kurt Cobain. But, whatever. That's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, unless there was some kind of youth outreach campaign to make him seem cool. Usually I don't compare people to Kurt Cobain that I'm trying to make, seem bad. But it's interesting, probably to his audience, being a cool rock star is one of the worst things you could be. It's better to be the cool kid's philosopher, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, given a choice between being Ben Shapiro and being Kurt Cobain, most people say, yeah, no, I'd like to be Shapiro. I'd much rather have people think of me the way they think of Ben Shapiro. Speaking of Ben Shapiro, that I did just want to highlight a little bit. We're going to be talking about Shapiro's fellow intellectual dark webmate, fellow intellectual dark. What would be the personal noun there? Webster.
Yeah, I think there's Webster's Barry Weiss, Webster Jordan Peterson.
He kind of is Webster because he's short too.
Fair
that
enough.
Was the low-hanging fruit,
so to speak. So we're going to be talking about his fellow intellectual dark Webster, Jordan Peterson, very shortly. That's going to be the main thing that we're going to be doing in this episode. A couple of years ago, I wrote part of a book called Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson that came out from Zero Books. That is the cover. I believe that is the anatomy of a lobster, if I'm remembering right, what that illustration on the front cover was supposed to be. So I wrote a chapter of that book, but most of it was then written by these three other people: Marion, Trejo-McManus, Conrad Hamilton, and Matt McManus, who will all be joining me later in the episode to check back in on Dr. Peterson. Now that he's back out and about, he's out in the world, saying interesting things, and and we're concerned with how he's doing. But we thought we'd check in. We're going to be continuing the Peterson check-in in the philosophy segment with Dr. Jen. We are going to be looking at some of Peterson's thoughts on free will and determinism. Although when I sent her the video that we're going to talk about, she asked what it was about. I said free will and determinism, and she said, "How can you tell?" Because I think it was not perhaps Peterson at his clearest. But then in the postgame, we are going to be joined by current affairs editor Nathan Robinson to talk about some of the arguments going around on Twitter about why we should start World War III and end all of human civilization, and why Nathan and I think that would be bad. That that the world is nice and we want it to keep existing. That's going to be our hot take in the postgame. But before we leave Ben Shapiro behind, I did just want to remind people, I think this wasn't what we played last week, but I do just want to highlight this moment from my episode of the Joe Rogan Experience where Ben Shapiro came up.
I'll get all this pushback, or someone like Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro's a lovely guy. Meet him, get to know him. He's very nice. I don't agree with him a lot,
Yeah.
a lot on a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look, if
But I love the guy.
Sure. I mean, look, if Ben Shapiro ever wanted to come on my show and argue with me, I would 100% do that.
I bet he'd do it.
Okay, well,
But he talks really fast. You got to be careful.
So, Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro and my mutual friend thinks that he would do it, and we're trying to figure out how to get in touch with my fellow Ben to offer that invitation. But we should have an episode, an update on that next episode. But I don't see why not. Right? I mean, that's he should do it.
It's like Battle of the Bastards from Game of Thrones, except it's Battle of the Bens.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure who my counterpart is over there at the Ben Shapiro show, but whoever they may be is welcome to contact me and, set up a friendly chat because from what I hear, he's a lovely, lovely man, as you just saw in the cold open. He has lovely things to say in a beautiful way with words and metaphors. So I'd love to have him on the show and just kind of have a free-flowing exchange of ideas.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Now, I had a different reaction to the State of the Union than Ben Shapiro did, perhaps unsurprisingly. I did write something for Jacobin about it. It was called Joe Biden's State of the Union didn't offer much for the working class, and the take is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. So if you watch the State of the Union, which I did, I said I would for Jacobin, so I watched every minute of that thing. I actually, let me pause. Do you guys watch it at all?
No, I just watched a couple clips here and there.
Okay.
No, as I told some friends, even though I'm only 30, I think my blood pressure would have spiked so badly watching him try to, because I kind of want him to succeed. You know what I mean? I hope he'll say the right things, and I know he won't. And between stumbling over his words, stumbling over his ideas, it's just so incredibly stressful and frustrating. I turned it off. So I'm sorry, I didn't do my research. All
right. Well, fair enough. Let me fill you in on what was in that speech. So the first chunk of it sounded like approximately the State of the Union address that a president would have given immediately after declaring war against Russia. That's what it sounded like. It was within the first 90 seconds, there was freedom will always triumph over tyranny, and there was a standing ovation for freedom will always triumph over tyranny. There were people waving little miniature Ukrainian flags. There was a chant of USA, USA. So to be clear, congressmen and senators chanted USA, USA at one point during the speech.
What year is this again?
2022, apparently. Our Straw McCollum, thank you for the super chat, says describes Joe Biden as lifeguard Reagan. But that's what the speech felt like. That it was a little bit, of the Joe Biden who we all know and love from the Corn Pop description, of his time as a lifeguard. There was a lot of skipped words. He was obviously pretty prepared text, but he would just sort of miss words. So there wouldn't be connective tissues between the nouns. And it was very strange to listen to at point, electronics, software, economy,
Maybe Shapiro meant he sounded like he was singing Nirvana lyrics, just kind of free associative. Yeah, just a poetic mishmash. Okay, yeah, cool.
No, that's fair. In which case, maybe Ben Shapiro has a point. But there was a lot of that. But yeah, most of the first section was just this flag waving intense thing about Russia and Ukraine. And then he kind of awkwardly transitions to domestic policy because, of course, he has not started a war with Russia, thank God. And then it got a little bit more lackluster, right? I mean, he seemed to be very enthusiastic in the first part. The second part, he said some good things at various points in it, but there was really no acknowledgement of why these good things had not come to pass. So, for example, he mentioned one of the good parts of the speech is he mentioned that the minimum wage should be raised to $15. I was like, okay, great. But hold up. Didn't we already, wasn't there already an incredibly half-assed attempt to do that died in the Senate because it was because the Senate parliamentarian said, no, you can't. that raising millions and millions of people out of poverty wouldn't have the significant budgetary impact that it would need to have to go into a reconciliation bill, which is an absurd opinion on its face. And even though the Senate parliamentarian is a low-level staffer who the Democrats could literally just fire, right, at any point, and who issues non-binding opinions, they just kind of shrugged their collective shoulders and said, "Oh, I guess I can't." And lo and behold, here we are at the State of the Union, and he's talking about it as if there has been no attempt to do it so far. There's a lot of stuff like that. Like a lot of the good stuff was stuff like that. It was also kind of striking how much, if you could remember all the way back, yeah, exactly, $15 10 years ago would have been nice. If you could remember all the way back to 2020, when Joe Biden was running for president. Okay, Andy's shaking his head. He does not remember that.
Too long ago.
Yeah, fair enough. It's like the South Park episode where they're making fun of Children of the Corn, and the kids keep on talking about the before time and the long ago, and then at like the end of the episode, spoiler, they established that it was like 2 weeks. So yeah, in 2020, when Biden was running for president, he was campaigning on a public option for healthcare. So that, he wasn't willing to go as far as Bernie, Medicare for all. But if you go look at his campaign website right now, it's never been taken down. It says on there that every single American, whether they're uninsured right now, whether they're currently on employer health insurance, whether they're on whatever, right? Every single American will have the option of buying into a Medicare-style public healthcare plan. And I thought it was kind of remarkable that this demand just like disappeared in the State of the Union. That there was a point where he started talking about the antiviral like COVID pills, which, right? Godspeed on that. Cannot happen, come quick enough. But he said that these are going to be free, that if you test positive, you get the antiviral, COVID pills for free, which is fantastic. I'm all for it. But then he said, like in a different part, he's talking about insulin. And all he says about insulin is that it'll be capped, like the price of insulin will be capped at an affordable rate. So no hint that like everybody who wants to could just be on some public healthcare program that would cover 100% of the cost of insulin. It's just no. We'll just cap it at a low rate, right? So because it's outrageous that people should have to not afford their insulin, so we're going to make it affordable. And this is really confusing to me because diabetics who don't get their insulin can die in much the same way that people who get COVID can die. And it's very unclear to me what the principle is whereby one of these things should be free at the point of service and one of them doesn't need to be. It's okay for it to just be affordable. I mean, why, if that's good enough, why can't the COVID pills just be affordable?
That's a question that I ask Kevin Sorbo every day.
Deep Cut is the last week's episode, if anybody wants to check that out. Kevin Sorbo is sort of coming out at the opposite direction. He's like, well, I mean, if it's fine for these to be free, why can't it all be free? But it is really a very confusing double standard, right? Why it should be both. And I should also say, actually, the best comment I saw, we don't have the tweet, I forgot to ask for it, but the best comment I saw about this, which I quote in the Jacobin article, was from our friend and repeat past guest, Anna Kasparian, who noted that it would have been nice to see a little bit of love in the speech for labor and what it's been able to accomplish for itself without any help from Congress or the executive branch. There was a sort of passive mention of the PRO Act, which, is at this point in terms of like any serious investment of political capital to make it happen is a rapidly fading memory. But, certainly no mention of those, of REI, of the successful John Deere strike, of how many are we up to? 100 and something Starbucks locations around the country?
Yeah, at least.
Yeah. And I think this is the point I really like ended up the article on, which is just that this is going to be, if the political landscape doesn't change, then, and also if, the US and Russia don't end the world with a global thermonuclear exchange, but if the political, which would change the political landscape itself, I suppose. But if the political landscape doesn't change, this is what it's going to keep being like, right? Because some of these same promises that Biden made when he was running for president that have already faded away and didn't even show up in his first State of the Union were exactly the same ones that Barack Obama made when he was running for president. In 2008, when Obama was running for president, he was running on card check, which is a major element of the PRO Act, that was part of Obama's 2008 campaign platform, to make it easier to organize a union. Obama was running on a public option in 2008, and by this time in his presidency, those things had already started to become memory hold, which is exactly what's happening now with Biden. And if nothing changes, this is going to keep being what it's being like, we hear about a public option during the, or maybe it'll be Medicare for all eventually, but whatever it is, we'll hear about it during the primaries and maybe a little bit during the general, and then nothing once the person comes to office. And where Anna's point, I think, is incredibly important and relevant is that if we ever want to not be like this, right, it's going to have to be because there's some sort of external shock that changes the political landscape. And I think that's going to have to be a more organized working class, because, you wouldn't have had the New Deal without that. You certainly wouldn't have had the Great Society without that. Like, even these sorts of, forget like even real social democracy, never mind what we would all like. Even the sort of semi-social democratic things that have happened in the American past would not have happened without a more organized and militant working class than we have now. And if it's ever not going to keep being like this, that's got to be the way out.
Yeah, I think what's especially frustrating about not even mentioning, for example, Starbucks, is most of the shit that he could just say regarding the working class wouldn't do anything. Like most workers probably don't even know what the PRO Act is. But if you're a worker at Starbucks and the president of the United States said, if you're thinking about forming a union at your Starbucks, like I have your back. You know what I mean? Like that could do a lot to get rid of the fear. So that's like the one area he could actually do anything. And the other thing I think is kind of funny is you think about, like what some past Democratic presidents have been able to do, like, the New Deal or the Great Society. Now it seems like they're just trying to be the president that you could say, hey, remember when they mentioned like the New Deal in a speech? Like that's going to be their legacy. Like they mentioned some really okay policies in a speech. Like that's their crowning achievement.
Just like FDR.
Yeah, both of them mention it in these policies and speeches, so they have that in common. But it would be really nice, I think, if I was an organizer working on that campaign or a worker, just to hear something. He did the bare minimum when it came to Amazon. And his comments about the Bessemer campaign, and to hear that he didn't even mention it is not surprising, but it's a shame.
Yeah, it is absolutely a shame. Okay, so I did 2 other articles for Jackman last week. I do want to just really briefly mention before we move on. The most recent one was about Ukraine. It was called a no-fly zone in Ukraine would start World War III. It's the worst idea possible. And the headline pretty much sums up the argument. I'm just going to mention that right now because, as I've already said, in the postgame for Gift and Argument patrons, current affairs editor Nathan Robinson is going to be joining us, and we are going to talk about this in a lot more detail, and go over some of what I think we would both describe, although the people who put them out presumably wouldn't describe as pro World War III tweets. But yeah, to my mind, the Ukraine issue is incredible. Obviously, in terms of diplomatic resolution and what's going to happen, that's all incredibly complicated and messy. I think a lot of the history leading up to it is incredibly complicated and messy. But as far as what the left's take should be, I think it's actually really simple. That you shouldn't make excuses for Russian imperialism. And it's true that there are some people in what we would broadly describe as the left who've done that, and you shouldn't do that. But also, as an American, your primary duty is to oppose American imperialism, and we should really, really, really oppose all of the calls for the United States to become militarily involved in Ukraine, both in general, because wars are always bad for the working class, and we should oppose those in principle. But in particular, in this case, because it could be the end of the world, and the end of the world, again, hot take, would be a bad thing. The other article that I put out in Jacobin last week was about Texas. It was called Texas Republicans Trample Their Own Principle to Attack Trans Kids. And it was partially inspired by an exchange that I had with Joe Rogan when I was on JRE last week. I think that we have a clip of that if we're going to play that.
There's a lot of decisions that we don't allow people to make until they're of grown age, like tattoos. You can't get your face tattooed when you're 4, but you can when you're 24. You know, it's. I mean, I'm not saying that they're the same thing, but what I am saying is that it's
a hard issue, right?
We're faced with many dilemmas that require discussions and compassionate, comprehensive discussions. And the only way you can do that is without censorship.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously I completely agree on that. I mean, I think that the, youth transition thing, again, I think that this is a little bit of a hard case, because I think that on the one hand, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea, no sane person thinks that little kids should have complete medical autonomy and just get to do whatever they want. That would be ridiculous. But at the same time, not getting a tattoo when you're a kid isn't gonna have some really bad effect. You can just wait and it's fine, right? Whereas with something like this, if you do have that experience that that you feel as if you're trapped in the wrong kind of body, which I'd imagine could be incredibly traumatic if that's not dealt with.
We can only imagine.
Yeah, exactly. I literally don't know, but it sounds like it.
Neither one of us know.
But I think that then having to go through what from your perspective is the wrong puberty, right? I mean, the stakes are higher than the tattoo thing. And as we were having that conversation in Texas, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, and the attorney general were acting to legally crack down on any trans kids, not only who, and I think a lot of the people are getting surgical transition at the age of 5 or whatever stuff is right-wing propaganda. It's bullshit, right? But not only surgical transition, but puberty blockers, right? Precisely the thing that the point I was making to Rogan. And, look, I know some people would be happier if I'd gone in that, with both guns blazing and, and sort of done it as an own. But I actually don't think that's the right way to approach these conversations. If you're talking to somebody who is not, is not a raging reactionary, is at least somewhat open to what you're saying, I think that the way you should do it is you should signal that you understand what they're saying, right? You get it, but have you thought about blah, 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 right? It's really not the same as getting a tattoo, that this is a much higher stakes thing. And this is, and the issue, with the Texas thing in particular is not what do you think the clinical standards should be, which I think right after that clip cuts off, I say, look, I don't know. I'm not a medical expert. You're not either, right? What exactly the, standards should be for how much counseling you need, whatever, is best left to medical experts. But whatever you think it should be, this attempted crackdown in Texas, it doesn't matter how much counseling you've gotten, right? And it doesn't just apply to surgical transition, it applies to going on puberty blockers. So if, in other words, the governor and attorney general of Texas do literally want to force kids to go through what would be, I think just a little bit of empathy should show you would be a really horrifying experience. That it would be, I mean, look, if you imagine some sort of science fiction, scenario where against your will you're going to be physically transformed into the other gender, you wouldn't like that very much. And that's what they're talking about, putting people through. And the point that I make in the Jacobin piece is that there is an amazing disconnect between the stated principles of Texas Republicans and what they're actually advocating in this case, right? That these are all people who love to use this libertarian language about, individuals and families should be able to do what they want, and they shouldn't have intrusive government bureaucrats coming down to tell them what to do. But literally, this this order from Governor Abbott and the Attorney General letter talks about prosecuting for child abuse. Not only any parent who allows their child to go on puberty blockers, not only the doctors, but any other licensed professionals, doctors, nurses, teachers who know about it. Right. So it's like, okay, on the one hand, if you remember that Charlie Kirk debate last fall, we're talking about people who were a little bit too libertarian to be okay with raising Jeff Bezos' taxes by 1% to pay for housing for homeless veterans, right? They're a little bit too libertarian for that, but they're not quite libertarian enough to be against criminally prosecuting some trans kid's 8th grade math teacher for not ratting them out to the Texas, Department of Family Protective Services, because they went on puberty blockers.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you completely. I mean, I do think the more rhetorically effective way to go would have been to just punch him and then just like run out of the studio and never come back. I think his subscriber would have been like, damn, I was wrong. And now my
But before you run out the door, you got to yell, "You've been owned."
Yeah.
There are so many leftists on Twitter who would have been so happy if I'd done that. But yeah, probably not a rhetorically effective move to make for his audience. I think it's a relatively simple thing. I think the hypocrisy is just astonishing. And I know there are always people who say, oh yeah, but this is the kind of point that's been made about conservative hypocrisy so many times. What's the point? And I would just urge, as I always do, that just because something's old hat to you doesn't mean that's not somebody else's first time hearing it. They're dropping new human beings every day, right? Everybody has a first time when they start to think about this stuff, right? Everybody has their own tipping point. So,
I'd say start your babies on Ben Burgis early as possible, to give them as many arguments as possible.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My children are actually sitting. Oh no, they went to bed.
All right. Well, you got to rouse them from bed and make sure they watch the rest of the show. They don't become Jordan Peterson fans by not inoculating them.
Yes.
Okay. Last Rogan clip I want to play before we bring on Matt and Marion and Conrad in just a minute is on a somewhat related issue. And I think in some ways, and I wanted to play this because last week, well, if you only watched on YouTube, you didn't see very much of this because Spotify is extremely vigilant about their intellectual property. But if you watched, so the YouTube version ended up getting a lot of this cut out. But if you watched it on the Facebook live stream, or we posted on the Patreon, the full video, or if you listen to the podcast version, you heard a lot of the parts of the Rogan interview. We were talking about economics, about Medicare for all, about labor unions, about the post office, postal banking, teachers unions, economic inequality, Mondragon, why it'd be good if we had a society that was dominated not by regular capitalist corporations, but by worker co-ops. But I did just want to play one other not directly economic part of it. I do think that it's, when I say not directly economic, I do think that part of the reason that conservatives have such a hard on for going after public schools is that it's one of the few institutions in our neoliberal hellscape that's A, publicly owned, and B, solidly unionized, at least in a lot of states. So I think there's an economic tie-in. But in any case, let's do the before we go into the Peterson stuff, let's do the CRT clip. I mean, look, this is the same reason I don't like, I don't like the CRT laws either, right? Because I don't like the idea that there are going to be people who are second guessing, what happened in some classroom to say like, was this too close to like, to one of these ideas that we don't like, right? Did you talk to your students about something that like flew a little bit too close to the sun of CRT? And that makes me
By CRT, you're talking about critical
Oh
race
yeah,
theory,
sorry, critical. Critical race theory. Yeah, and I think that like actual critical race theory, there are parts I agree with, there are parts that I disagree with, but I don't want to live in I want to live in the kind of society where when there's like some controversial idea that's out there, like that, like people can talk about it and debate about it, and like if you can, like you could discuss it with students in a classroom. Like I think ideally the way that education should work, it should foster critical thinking. Like instead of like, this is exactly what you should think.
For sure.
You should be encouraging students to like, to think about it, more clearly and to argue about it and to, and to decide what they think, right? Like ultimately, if you want people to be citizens in a democracy, right, to the extent that we have one of those, like that's what you want. Like that's how you want them to grow up, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. You want discussion.
So I think, and I know James Lindsay's been on the show. I have not watched it, I will admit, because I mean, there are only so many minutes and hours in the day. I'm not going to watch 3 hours of James Lindsay if I don't have to. But James Lindsay is one of the intellectual like leading figures of the movement to ban CRT or ban what they call CRT in public schools, has been on the Joe Rogan Experience. And again, I don't know if you push back against him in that interview, but I suspect this might have been the first time anybody ever made that case against the CRT laws on the show. And he seemed to agree, right? I mean, like at the end of the clip, right? He seemed to think so, and maybe, and whatever, maybe he, maybe he really didn't, or on later reflection, he didn't. I mean, I have no idea. All I know is what he said in the moment. But I also think whether he did or didn't, I think that just, I don't know, having all those billions of people who watch the Joe Rogan Experience, like, see that case and hear it. And here Rogan apparently agreed with it. I mean, I think if you're interested in influencing people on this topic, I have a hard time seeing how that could be a bad thing.
Yeah, same. I mean, I still propose we do some kind of substance and do a Patreon episode of Joe and Conceptual James talking to each other. So super chat us if you want to see that. But I would be curious to see. But I'm glad that no matter what happened, that the audience had a corrective, and you presenting it from that angle for sure.
Yeah. Well. All right, so we get up to 1,000 patrons or something. We'll all take mushrooms and watch James Lindsay talk to Joe Rogan for 3 hours for patrons.
The only way to do it.
Fair enough. All right, guys. I will see the two of you in the post game. Let's get Matt McManus and Marion Trejo-McManus and Conrad Hamilton on here. Conrad, I should say, Conrad is really above and beyond the call of duty here. Because what time is it where you are?
It's 2:35 right now.
Yeah, all right, that is some dedication.
Metal as fuck, dude.
I also visited a friend's art installation tonight, so my sleep tonight is consisting of like 3 power naps that are spaced between now and 8:30 in the morning tomorrow when I have to teach, or tonight, as the case may be. So, but I do it for you, Ben.
Well, that's making me tired just to hear. But fair enough. So this has been a little while. It's like a little over a year ago, maybe, that we did the original Jordan Peterson episode.
I think so. I think it's like once a year on the anniversary of its release. There are 2 things that I remember from that time period. One is that my life went to hell because of COVID, and the other is that our Jordan Peterson book comes out. So got to commemorate both of those.
Hopefully the one served as recompense for the other, Matt. That's equal global pandemic catastrophe. Yeah. But we got Myth and Mayhem out there. It's worth it, man.
That's it, right? I was just sitting there. I'm like, man, my life is completely changed. Where am I? I don't know what I'm going to do. But fuck it, we stuck it to the guy. It all balances out in the case.
I thought you were going to say that I thought you were going to say your life had completely changed because of the book, but you kind of went the other way, which disappointed me.
I just wanted to say, Ben, I actually wrote a review for Jacobin of Lindsay's new book because I just heard you talking about that. I won't spoil too much because it'll be coming out reasonably soon. But one of the things I want to point out is that he calls critical race theory a sweeping set of conspiracy theories about race and racial power in Western liberal democracies. Yes. And then later on in the book, he claims that critical race theory is infecting and undermining every school, college, university, workplace, office, hospital, every magazine, journal, newspaper, every television program, movie, website, every government agency, institution, program, every church, synagogue, mosque, every club, affinity, pastime, and interest in the country. That's a direct quote, by the way. So that should give you a sense of the beauties that are to be found in James Lindsay's take on critical race theory. And I defy anyone to go through it without getting an incredible headache like I did.
Yeah, that's Race Marxism is the title of that book, which, because we live in a depraved world, was, I think, something like number 74 on all of Amazon at one point. So a lot of people are reading Conceptual James. But we're not gathered here today to talk about James Lindsay. We're here to talk about his predecessor, Dr.
Venerable
Jordan.
lineage.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, I think it kind of is, right? Because as far as I can tell, Jordan Peterson's master thesis in like 2018 is that postmodernism equals Marxism equals annoying blue-haired college kids. And now James Lindsay has come along, and he's taken that basic thing and he's added critical race theory, the CDC, 6 or 7 other entities to the list.
Oh yeah, I mean, in the book, there's cultural Marxism, classical Marxism, postmodern neo-Marxism, right? There's more Marxisms than there are Skittle flavors at this point in that book. And I defy anyone to keep track of them. Although I will say he does make an effort to do so. Not one that's particularly coherent, but there's an effort. Right?
Fair enough. Marion, has it been like harder to live with Matt since he's been reading James Lindsay?
Oh God, yeah. Sometimes he's reading and I hear on the back like, God damn it, or like, like this break ground, and I'm like, what did he say now? This was specifically pointing out that he was like, I know you guys did the Dugin episode, and that was interesting. He got so mad so many times. I could hear him like, and he would raise to me, tell me this is not annoying.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, if you come to our apartment, it's a good sign I'm reading some conservative literature. If I'm swearing a lot, drinking even more than usual, and if I go out for like routine smoke breaks. Conrad, I also been known to partake at some point. I try to cut down, but when you're going through Dugin or Lindsay or even Peterson, there's just something about a cigarette that feels so necessary.
Yeah, I don't even read this stuff, and I chain smoke, so God. That's like at your house, right? You got to be careful, right? In case you start, you got to be careful to dodge the book in case you windmill it across the room, right? That wasn't intended for you.
All right. Well, in an effort to give everybody lung cancer, I want to watch a clip of Jordan Peterson since he's emerged and become active again in the last few months. He and I have something in common, which is that we have both been guests on the same show recently, and this is one where Peterson is telling Joe Rogan about climate change and why he doesn't think it's possible to have science about climate change.
One is a weird one. So
that's because there's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay. But your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on a set number of variables.
Yeah.
So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. Well, how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? And that's not just a criticism. That's like, if it's about everything, your models aren't right. Because your models do not and cannot model everything.
What do you mean by everything when you say?
Well, but that's what people who talk about the climate apocalypse claim in some sense. We have to change everything. It's like everything, eh? Okay, what? And the same with the word environment. That word doesn't mean it means much that it actually doesn't mean anything. Like when you say everything, in a sense, that's meaningless, right? Because, well, what are you pointing to? Well, I'm pointing to everything. Well, what's the difference between the environment and everything? There's no difference. What's the difference between climate and everything? Well, there's no difference. So this is a crisis of everything? It's like, no, it's not. Or if it is, well, if it really is, then we're done because we can't fix everything.
This, by the way, from the man who once said that ideas make the world, or indeed ideas are the world in a more than metaphysical sense, right? Now hectoring us about how precisely we try to define the term environment. So,
yeah, I love the shit eating grin at the end of that. It's like, well, I mean, if it is everything, then, we're done. Like it just, it is he has a really interesting sense of how science works. I mean, there's also a different part that there wasn't in that clip where he says that you can't have models to predict climate change because models have to be about information that is from the past, and so you can't have models that predict the future based on what happened in the past.
I think that's just Hume's inductive reasoning argument. I mean, I'm not an expert in empirical philosophy, but I'm not sure if that invalidates all scientific prediction.
no, this is what irritates me about it, because, again, he seems so close to discovering basic truths of the philosophy of science, and then he constantly backs away from them if that leads to bad political outcomes for him, right? Because, of course, you could claim that anything is about everything, right? Politics could be about everything, because if you extend outwards from human beings, you have to talk about biology, talk about physics, talk about all that, right? But, we can appreciate that when we're trying to engage in empirical research, that we have to narrow our field of vision and make testable hypotheses that exclude a huge number of variables. But what he doesn't account for is the fact that it's no single person who's doing this. It's not like there's one environmental scientist out there saying, I'm going to go out and single-handedly make hypotheses after hypotheses about every facet of the environment over the globe. You have literally thousands of climate scientists doing this over many decades, accumulating data and sharing it. And that's how I reach something approximating a scientific consensus. And there might be flaws with this method, right? But it's generally worked pretty well when it comes to predicting things like, I don't know, our basketball is going to drop from the CN Tower if you let them go, because gravity will operate upon them. And it's baffling to me that he doesn't appreciate these very basic truths about the scientific method, or truisms, I should say, that most of us learned in grade 10 chemistry or something.
Well, it's also kind of funny, like when he talks about, like the limitations of these kinds of variables. It's like, because like you'd almost forget, when he's saying that this is like a guy who's attempting to explain like, all human personality, based on like a biologization of a set of like Jungian archetypes, something like that, right? So it's amazing. It's really interesting what meets the bar for what science is and what doesn't, right?
I think
Yeah.
sorry,
Barry, please.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking of one of the criticisms that, like, all of us, I think, raised in our essays for the book, which was that despite of giving himself this rule in the 12 Rules for Life, that you have to be, accurate in your, like, be precise in your discourse and when you are, like, making arguments. And how many times he fails to do so, because in the clip that you just showed, he seems to be first criticizing, like, the scientists for like their methodological kind of concerns about trying to talk about everything, but then he's also criticizing like the critiques they are making about, I don't know, like about how everything is also wrong with the world. Like, it seems to me that he's making two sets of claims there that he's just conflating, which is like one about the method and one about like the set of claims they are making. I don't know, like I always find it difficult with Peterson to break down like some of the things he's saying, precisely because because he fails to be so accurate about things that he talks. And like as Matt was saying, like things we like sometimes learn like so long time ago about this is how science operates, etc.
Yeah, and I want to point out, like, my philosophy of science isn't particularly advanced, but I kind of broadly endorse a kind of neo-Popperian view with a little bit of Lakatos thrown in, right? And I do think that there is something, again, to the idea that science is a communal enterprise, which is one of the reasons that I have a lot of respect for climate scientists, right? If you were to talk to any one of them, they would tell you that they just have a fraction of the story because they can only test a limited range of variables in a very circumscribed situation. And that's how they can accumulate relatively plausible knowledge about it, or unfalsifiable knowledge, if you'd rather use a more technical term, right? Non-falsified knowledge. And gradually speaking, over time and over the course of, I think what it is now, we started studying this in the early 20th century, right? We've accumulated a massive data about how it is that industrial trends have shifted the climate in very bad directions. And this has been unfalsified for a huge period of time at this point, to the point where I think there are more scientists who now agree with the idea that man-made climate change is real than agree with the idea that the theory of evolution as posited by Darwin is a plausible hypothesis for how human life emerged, right? That's a pretty good number of people.
Well, I don't think it's so different necessarily. There is perhaps a consistency in a sense with this sort of postulate of the significance of or the defining status of ideas for society, because I think that I'm reminded here of there's a passage by Louis Althusser, an appendix to on contradiction and overdetermination. And in it, what he basically points out is that any kind of scientific thesis, if we want to critique it through the prism of philosophy, will be proven inadequate at some point, right? Precisely because the nature of philosophy is that we start with questions like, how does one access reality, right? This sort of inductive argument we were talking about that's kind of reprised from Hume, but ultimately science has a provisional quality to it, right? There's certain presuppositions which are made, which are a condition to the kinds of provisional information it's capable of generating, right? But again, if you want to take that sort of philosophic angle, I think it is you can discredit any argument that way, right? It's scientific. Right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So I mean, and I'd also point out, like, Jordan Peterson is a big fan of free market economics on the basis of the good results that he says have come about in the past, right? He'll make this sort of very simple, sort of Steven Pinkerish argument that capitalism for the last, however many hundreds of years has, raised the floor of people's living standards, such and such amount. And there's always this implication, at least hovering over it, that this will continue to happen in the future. And of course, economics, I mean, that's like all of the, all of the decisions that people make, right? The buying and selling decisions, at least. There is at least an interesting double standard here. Marion mentioned one of his rules was relevant to this. And I do want to go back to the rules in a minute, because there are, since we wrote the book, there are 12 new ones. It's we're up to 24 rules for life, not just 12. It's a lot harder.
One for every hour of the day.
That's right. But first, I do want to say to be fair, that in that clip that we just played, he doesn't stop at just saying that, well, I don't know what environment means or climate means, so what are we even talking about here, right? Like, he does sort of acknowledge that environmental problems or climate problems could exist. But I think his solution is really interesting. Jake, do we have the second part of this clip?
The fastest way to make the planet sustainably green and ecologically viable is to make poor people as rich as possible, as fast as we possibly can. Because the thing about poor people is that, well, first of all, they live in they're not resource efficient. They use a lot of resources to produce very, very little outcome. And so that's a problem. Slash and burn agriculture, for example. But even more importantly, when you're insecure on a day-to-day basis, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're not paying attention to the broader environment, that hated word, around you. And you can't even really worry about your children's future in some real sense, because like, no, you don't understand. Lunch is the future. We don't have lunch, we're hungry, and that goes on for like a month, we're dead. That's the future. So what happens, if you can get resources to the poorest section of the population, as soon as they get to the point where they have some hope of a genuine future, especially for their children, they immediately become concerned about broader environmental considerations. And then the attempt to make the environment habitable and sustainable, that comes up of its own accord at a grassroots level and spreads everywhere.
Oh. This annoys me so much because he's repeating the trope that there's a poorest that gonna pollute the more and are responsible for like the most like CO2 and like gas emissions, which again the data shows that that's not true. Like on average, like it's people on the like have better incomes or have higher incomes, the ones that we have the most like energy kind of consuming like lifestyles, like like people like have houses in the like in developed countries that have AC, heating, like pools, like it like there's data that actually shows how it's this like part of the population that are the ones actually responsible for that. So although I kind of appreciate his concern now with like raising people out of poverty, like repeating this trope, like, oh, because these are the ones that aren't concerned with the environment. And it also annoys me on the level of like all the environmentalists, like indigenous environmentalists that precisely like their defense of the land and their lifestyle is precisely out of a concern because of the environment, like especially in the third world and in Latin America, and particularly from Mexico, the country I come from. That's like they come not only from a defense of dispossession of land, like environmentalists also are defending precisely the environment and the repercussions that it will have. And these are poor people, usually that they've been impoverished, right, by the state, by capitalism. So I don't know, I'm just like, yeah, like this failure he has, as you were saying, of kind of like just pick, like he kind of picks like data and like certain like science, right? Like, oh, this helps my argument, so I will include it here. Like,
well, there's another issue going on there, which is that I think the kernel of truth in his argument is that like if you look at a lot of countries which are poorer than the United States, for example, you see that they have higher emissions per person on the surface level, right? But that occurs within a particular context. Right. So a lot of countries, in Africa, which are not industrial powerhouses, for example, their emissions per person are way below like a 200th of the average American. But what you'll find is that, in China, for example, it's higher than the US. But then you ask yourself, well, why is that? Right. And it's because China is the manufacturing hub in the world. And actually, it's because they're producing things for American consumers. Right. So if you actually trace the goods, not on the basis of where they're produced, right, but who they're being produced for, where the demand actually exists, then you realize that the problem, has almost entirely to do, right, with the copious levels of consumption which exist in the West, right? So I just find it to be quite a confused sort of analysis in general,
Yeah, and I want to put it a somewhat different way. Because one of the kind of main lines of criticism that he engages in when he directs these kinds of attacks towards the left, I do actually have a little bit of sympathy towards, because he'll frequently attack the kind of primitivist version of the left, which says that we need to rein back development for the sake of preserving the environment. Interestingly enough, I think this also echoes the criticisms that Marx made of the Luddites, for instance, in the 19th century, right? That the way to smash capitalism was actually to smash the machines of capitalism rather than change social relations, right? And the reason I think this is a bad argument is that the world actually produces an excess of food every year. Right. The main leftist critique that I have sympathy with would say, look, we already have everything that we need to give people the good quality of life that he's talking about. And we're not doing it not because the resources are unavailable, because of those social relations. So for instance, the United States alone, about 30% of the food produced is thrown out every year rather than redistributed, including to the United States as poor, right? And you can see comparable numbers around the globe because since the Green Revolution, we produce an excess of food every year. And despite that, we still have 1 billion people in poverty. Nathan Robinson wrote a really good article about this, right? Where he said, the primitivist argument doesn't work because we want the technology available to give people a high quality of life. But what's never really acknowledged by people like Tinker or Peterson is that these technologies and the resources have existed for a long time now. So it's the social system that's the problem that needs to be changed if we're going to provide people with the kind of life that they deserve and the kind of environment that they deserve, for that matter.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think this is the biggest problem with it. I mean, it's certainly true, as Marion points out, that the consumption, that much more environmental destruction, of course, is caused by things that are done to service consumption needs of people who have more income, obviously, but also that I think it is really significant that all he could imagine, right, as a solution to this is that you'll just change the motivations of individual people, and then I don't know, they'll come up with something, right? That you're going to have that once the psychology of individual people change, that that they'll care more about the quality of the environment, that that'll somehow or another get it done by itself. And again, I mean, I agree with Conrad. I mean, it's not like there's nothing to the idea that that you have to that people in some circumstances who don't have their basic material needs met will be more resistant to certainly anything that smacks of sacrifice for long-termist reasons. But again, he just the idea that something could be a product of bad systems or bad institutions is something that he just seems to be completely resistant to. I mean, from hearing that, you would get the impression that the practices that caused the most environmental damage, were arrived at from democratic procedures in which the poorest people in the world got to decide what had happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is where I actually think something like Marxism can be extremely helpful as a kind of analytical lens, because again, one of the criticisms made by the Luddite movement, which is in some senses the first kind of leftist primitivist movement, was that the basis for immiseration of the working classes was the machines that were created, right? That machines threw people out of work. This kind of bourgeois argument that there was a one-to-one or an aggregate relation between jobs created and jobs lost was wrong. And so what we do is we go in and smash the machines. And somewhere Marx wrote that over the course of the 19th century, one profound development was the proletariat coming to realize that machines weren't the enemy, right? It was the social relations that were the problem. And I think something very true something very similar is true today, which is that we have to realize that the technologies which enable us to produce food, with the exception of the meat industry, I think, are generally good things. And the world produces enough food for everyone to have a 2,600 caloric intake a day, I think is what I saw, which is above average, by the way. The problem is the social relations, global social relations, I should say, surrounding food and other forms of development. And that's what we need to change by confronting capital, especially neoliberal capital.
Well, I think though with Marxism, we should add, I don't disagree with you. I think that the vision of Marxism is very, very powerful in terms of how it situates the problem at the level of social relations, which Peterson consistently, fails to do when he establishes these sort of binaries, right? I think in this clip, he starts out and he says like, the left claims they want to help the poor, but, invariably, this is going to have some sort of environmentally deleterious effect. I mean, the question here is never really set up in terms of redistribution of wealth or the effects of an economy that's predicated on consumption or these kind of things. But I also think that in a way, I agree with you about I think the positivity of Marx's vision. I just want to say that there are certain issues there, right? I think Marx took it as quite definitive at a certain point in his career that Liebig's sort of discovery of soil science completely disproved the Malthusian hypothesis, right? According to which there were these sort of finite limits, right, to production. And later on in Marx's work, there are signs that he started to, move away from that hypothesis and to think that, well, maybe actually, maybe we shouldn't take it as an article of faith, right? The production can always be augmented, right? In a context where that isn't going to have, permanent damaging effects. So it's, it's a little bit inchoate, but I think, this whole idea of metabolic rift, right, with like John Bellamy Foster, part of the focus is to try to, demonstrate that Marxism needn't be a sort of thoughtless productivism in that way, right? So, I think one can talk about social relations, but we also have to have, a model for, what nature is. Right, to use these vagaries Peterson protests so much, against what climate is, and what the foreseeable limitations of production will be within that context, and given the social, nexus available to us.
Yeah, fair enough. I would also say, I think to Matt's point that, I think that there's a assumption that is bad that that does maybe go into part of what Peterson's criticizing in some of the less thought out left takes on climate change, that just sort of producing less per se, right, is the way out, right? And I think I just point people to like what my friend Lee Phillips has written about this stuff, that I think you need to, in some ways, like step up certain kinds of technological development to deal appropriately with climate change. But regardless, I think we can agree that just changing individual behavior or changing the psychology of individual behavior is not going to get it done. Okay,
no, I would say though, I think that Zizek made a really good point on that, which is generally the kind of position I take on these, which is that the temptation the left needs to avoid is precisely adopting these kind of Petersonian dispositions, which holds climate change to be some kind of punishment for immoral individual behavior, right? And so the way to solve it is at the individual level by, religiously recycling, right, and making sure that all the cans go in the right back. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, and neither is he, right? But fixating on that and the kind of moralistic rhetoric that we often see associated with it divorces our attention away from the kinds of social relations and technological relations to nature, to appeal to Hamilton's point, that we need to be attentive to because they're at the basis of the problem, right? So I'm very wary of any kind of moralistic approach to resolving climate change, even if I do think that people should recycle, right? As Marion will tell you, something that I can sometimes be less than perfect on myself. So I'll chastise myself later on for that, but
Yeah. I have a get a Big Mac in the old-fashioned non-biodegradable containers and throw it out the window because I'm an American. In any case,
sit there and just waste food like in that Simpsons episode, right? Like,
goddamn straight. So I do want to get to the rules before we end, but I do want to take a little detour first because since Jordan Peterson has reemerged, he has also taken on a few new topics, including foreign policy. This is Jake. Do we have the Brezhnev clip?
The military maneuvers prompted a sharp rebuke from U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, who warned Russia that any military intervention in Ukraine would be a grave.
Sorry, that's not the one before. Do we have the real short one from before that? Do we not get that? Okay, never mind. So he has. There's a clip that apparently we don't have where Peterson says that Brezhnev gave Crimea to Ukraine when he was drunk. But there is also, I think we have a much longer one, but it's maybe worth watching a minute of, where of Peterson talking, quoting from a foreign leader about the dangers of wokeness. Do we have this one?
Finally, do you know that Vladimir Putin himself is capitalizing on this woke madness? Anna Majar Barducci at memri.org covered his recent speech. I quote from the article's translation. Putin speaking. The advocates of so-called social progress believe they are introducing humanity to some kind of a new and better consciousness. Godspeed, hoist the flags, as we say, go right ahead. The only thing that I want to say now is that their prescriptions are not new at all. It may come as a surprise to some people, but Russia has been there already. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks, relying on the dogmas of Marx and Engels, also said that they would change existing ways and customs, and not just political and economic ones, but the very notion of human morality and the foundations of a healthy society. The destruction of age-old values, religion, and relations between people, up to and including the total rejection of family, we had that too, encouragement to inform on loved ones. All this was proclaimed progress, and by the way, was widely supported around the world back then and was quite fashionable. Same as today. By the way, the Bolsheviks were absolutely intolerant of opinions other than theirs. Putin continues, "This, I believe, should call to mind some of what we are witnessing now. Looking at what is happening in a number of Western countries, we are amazed to see domestic practices, which we, fortunately, have left, I hope, in the distant past. The fight for equality and against discrimination has turned into aggressive dogmatism bordering on absurdity when the works of the great authors of the past, such as Shakespeare, are no longer taught at schools or universities because their ideas are believed to be backward. The classics are declared backward and ignorant of the importance of gender and race. In Hollywood, memos are distributed about proper storytelling and how many characters of what color or gender should be in a movie. This is even worse than the agitprop department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union." End of Putin's comments. This from the head of the former totalitarian enterprise, against whom we fought a 5 decades-long Cold War, risking the entire planet in a very real manner. This from the head of a country riven in a literally genocidal manner by ideas that Putin himself attributes to the progressives in the West, to the generally accepting audience of his once burned, twice shy listeners.
I have to say, I don't know what I'm kind of more offended by. One is that he seems to have at least some sympathy for what Vladimir Putin is saying, or that he thinks that this was a comment made in good faith by the authoritarian leader of an authoritarian state. Or secondly, that he thinks that all the things that he was describing was in any way comparable to the Soviet Gulag, which I also think is pretty offensive.
Yeah, I should say, by the way, we did find the Brezhnev clip, so just so you know, I'm not making that up.
I mean, I kind of approach it from the other angle than Matt. I mean, I certainly see the difference between the Soviet Union, and sort of liberal woke ideology. However, I think it's grossly unflattering toward the history of the Soviet Union, which raised 200 million people out of poverty and defeated the Nazis, among other things, to suggest that this sort of gloss that's placed on neoliberalism, right? In terms of identitarian politics and so forth, are somehow tantamount to that,
Okay, so on the one hand, the people that Peterson's criticizing never accomplished anything on the level of industrializing Russia and building World War II. So in that sense, he's given them too much credit. On the other hand, human resources departments, Hollywood executives, etc., who he's criticizing here, have probably never done anything quite as bad as the Ukrainian famine or the Gulag Archipelago. So he might be erring in both directions. But Jake, it's probably too much build up, and it's not as funny to everybody else's is to me. But let's do the Brezhnev clip after all.
I believe it was Brezhnev gave the Crimea to the Ukraine when he was drunk.
So there you go.
That was Khrushchev. It wasn't even Brezhnev's rule. I mean, I don't know all the particular details of this, but I know enough to know that that's wrong. It was 1954, right?
Yeah, Khrushchev was the Soviet premier when the Crimea was transferred from Russia to Ukraine within the USSR. And I actually also think, to be fair to Khrushchev, it probably wasn't just an impulse when he was drunk. There probably was some thought out policy stuff going on.
Probably had a few buffers there in the Soviet Union. Yeah, you think?
Yeah. There are probably people. I think even especially to Khrushchev. Right? I mean, if it was Stalin, like he could have just had that drunken impulse, and everybody would have just done it. But like with Khrushchev, there'd probably be people who are asking him the next morning, "Are you sure about this Crimea thing?" Because we don't actually have to do that.
I just want to say, I think the subtext, which is interesting about what Putin's saying there, is it's important to acknowledge that the second biggest party in Russia right now is the Russian Communist Party. So there are certain debates on the left about their legitimacy. Some people argue, for example, that they've hemmed toward the establishment to avoid being banned. But in any case, they certainly are calling for nationalization and socialization of large swathes of the Russian economy. And I think it's quite, germane to Putin in a way to, compare, sort of Western woke ideology associated with the dreaded Atlanticism, as Dugin would say, right? Because in a way he's analogizing, his political opposition in Russia, to the ideas which are favored in the Western countries, which he decries so regularly, right?
Yeah. And I mean, even if, how much actual opposition, the Communist Party of Russia provides, and how much that's, been pretty friendly to Putinists, I mean, is maybe a messier question, but it is interesting. It's something he keeps hammering on. Like when in Putin's big speech before invading Ukraine, he blamed the Lenin and the Bolsheviks for Ukrainian independence, and Ukrainian nationalism, essentially, which is really interesting. But I also find it really interesting that Peterson has this sort of, like a couple of these clips. He has, I don't know exactly what his take is on some of this stuff, but he does seem to have a certain amount of instinctive sympathy for Vladimir Putin, which is not necessarily totally out of character for a big defender of traditional hierarchies.
But
go ahead.
I was gonna say that it's his kind of I don't know how to say it other than annoying, but I remember when I read his preface to the new edition of the Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and the whole preface, like Jordan Peterson's point is like how we have to read this to avoid it, how like the horrible dangers of totalitarianism, how like the whole 12 Rules for Life is written with these references, comparing exactly how like this kind of like woke, what he calls woke measures on the West are equal, like they can be equal to these totalitarian, policies from the USSR. So now it's like interesting how like Putin's revisionism allows him to say, oh, but this was not, as you were saying, right? Like this was not totalitarian USSR. These were the wokes. Where like Putin in that same speech is like really like basically saying like, I like Stalin. Stalin was good. Stalin was the one that he became, and ordered all the mess all the Bolsheviks created. So I think that, I think like, as you were saying, Ben, like Peterson's kind of sympathies with this kind of authoritarian figures are about order, and about tradition. Like you can see how his personality really suits Putin, but it's also kind of interesting, like the extent, like both of these characters will go to kind of rewrite history in order to fit like their vision of the world, which is pretty like, of course, in this, and it's scarier when it comes from Putin, but still, like it's quite telling, I think.
Yeah, it is also. I mean, I remember reading something by Slavoj Žižek a while ago, where he pointed out that a really interesting thing about Putin's propaganda in Russia is that Stalin is sort of assimilated as like a great figure of Russian history, like Peter the Great or something, whereas Lenin. The Putinists really dislike, which makes sense in a lot of ways. For one thing, that sort of bringing him up would remind people that revolutions are possible. But I also, before we completely leave this, there was this very odd tweet that he had about the financial sanctions on Russia. Jake, do we have this? Okay. No, that's a different one. Although we'll do that one in just a second. But this one, he's talking about financial sanctions on Russia and Russian institutions. Is something like Russia being financially canceled or something is like the thing that he's quote tweeting, and he says they learned it from practicing on the truckers or something like that. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So the Globe and Mail tweet is how Canada helped facilitate support for banking sanctions.
That is good.
Russia. And Peterson says we learned how by practicing on truckers. And I'm having trouble understanding what's going on in this tweet. So it's the idea that see how and I mean whatever. I actually do think that I think the truckers are reactionary. The truckers, right? It's a goofy and reactionary movement. But I do think some of the emergency measures and stuff are bad. But also it's this is a weird line of thought here, right? What's it like? Oh, you see how bad this sort of measures taken against the truckers were because this led to sanctions on Russia or something?
No, I mean, this is part of the kind of paranoid attitude he's taken towards Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party generally of late. So if you followed his Twitter, like I did, and a lot of other people's besides, during the kind of controversy here in Canada, it was daily, just diatribe after diatribe about how Trudeau was moving the country in an authoritarian, totalitarian, ultra-woke, dangerous direction. And then when the Emergency Measures Act was passed, everything kind of exploded. And a lot of people felt he was vindicated. Other people pointed out that forcing a bunch of people out of downtown Ottawa in the middle of the winter doesn't really compare to throwing them into gulags, let alone into death camps, right? But, perspective on these things was lost. But I wanted to kind of gesture to something that you said earlier, which is that at various points he seems to be almost slightly sympathetic towards Putin. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that really should come as a surprise to us. He's made clear his admiration for Dostoevsky, who I'd like to point out again is a great novelist, and I'm not here to inhibit anyone from reading his works. But there's no doubt that Dostoevsky was a kind of persistent reactionary, certainly after his prison sentence. Probably the most prominent example of that you can read is his book Devils or Demons, where, spoiler alert, the socialists are the devils or the demons, along with the liberals, anarchists, and all the other kind of nihilists that are emerging in Russia at the time. And Dostoevsky had this kind of revanchist idea that Russia could be purged from modernity and occupy a kind of sacred theological space in the world as the rest rejected its heritage. And you can definitely see a lot of reactionaries attracted to that idea precisely because Putin has so consistently appealed to that, along with theorists like Alexander Dugin, who we talked about yesterday, Ben. And I think what you're seeing on the part of a lot of Canadian and especially American reactionaries is on the one hand, a kind of instinctive, almost visceral distaste for Russia and any kind of Russian militarism that's kind of a hangover from the Cold War, coupled precisely with this attraction to Russia as something approximating a model of the kind of society they'd like to see, right? One that is overtly spiritual, authoritarian, but allows high levels of freedom for capitalist elites and theological elites, very militantly socially conservative, and unafraid of asserting itself against woke liberalism in the world abroad, right? They've never been able to quite sort out the contradiction between this kind of instinctive anti-Russian attitude that's a hangover from the Cold War and this disposition, but it's definitely there. And I think as time goes on and the memory of the Cold War fades, more and more of them are just going to be coming out on the pro-Putin kind of side of things.
Yeah, right. That there is definitely like that meme with the person who's sweating while they're the two buttons, right? That's the So do we want to kill all the Russians? Because of just nationalistic, xenophobic fervor, or do we actually kind of admire Putin for creating a socially conservative traditionalist society?
I just want to say I think it's instructive regarding the journey of Russia and united Russia itself, right? Because I think one of the reasons why, if there is this sort of discrete admiration for Putin in Peterson's work, it's because, in Peterson, we see on one hand, the strong defense of traditional hierarchies and so on. And on the other hand, this belief that while not resembling it exactly, in a sense, the inequalities of neoliberalism befit, human societies, in light of the inherent inequitousness of nature, right? But I think that, United Russia has been somewhat amorphous itself, right? At first, I think it was presented, as a sort of, there was a stronger liberal element, right? I think around 2009, conservatism becomes codified as their official ideology, Russian conservatism. And in the wake of the invasion of Crimea, one of the strategies that Putin used, right, to deal with it was, essentially using public spending as well as military spending as recompense, for the damage that was being done to international commerce. I think what that saw was a tilt, right, towards away, a little bit away from liberalism that was always there, right, unbridled sort of neoliberalism, towards a more sort of nationalistic disposition. And I suspect that, in many ways, that's only eligible to accelerate now, in terms of the kind of sanctions which are being imposed and all of that, right?
I'd like also just to make one quick follow-up, which is something that really annoys me about this whole situation and Russia's attraction to Putin. There's a lot of things that annoy me about this. There'll be a long list of them soon enough. But I often talk about postmodern conservatism. We all have, since I've gotten everyone on board with that at some point or another. I won't reiterate the thesis there. But if you see the kind of rhetoric that Dugin, Putin, and others make, it exactly fits the model, the kind of thing that Jordan Peterson wails against time and time again. Putin is very happy to appeal to relativistic arguments, saying, you have your truths over in the West. We have our truths here in Russia. Alexander Dugin is exactly the same. He's happy to turn to arguments about hypocrisy to say, well, what about Western imperialism? What about Western interventionism? What about Western wokeism? So doesn't that dignify everything that we're doing here with our own kind of authoritarian measures? And if Peterson had any kind of concern with consistency, he would probably see a reflection of a lot of things that he hates in this kind of attitude, except now genuinely menacing, right? We're talking about an authoritarian state that is imprisoning thousands of its own people at the moment because they're protesting against the war. But that's not the thing that we're supposed to be concerned about. Apparently, we're supposed to be concerned instead about Hollywood asking us to have more people of color in Marvel movies, as though that's going to bring about the apocalypse. Not the madman who just aimed 9,000 nuclear weapons at the rest of the world and said, stay the fuck out of our country.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point, the sort of Putin bringing up, Western imperialism and hypocrisy and all of that. I mean, I think it's complicated because I do think that in that case, of course, it's been done for a very cynical reason, But I also think that asking, what about questions, right? Something about this for current affairs right now is oftentimes extremely important, actually, as a test for consistency. You should ask. You should ask what about, right? That say, okay, what about the Iraq War? What's because I think it's a way of ensuring that that you have a coherent set of commitments, right? So in that case, for example, right, like when the United States invaded Iraq, if other powers had responded by targeted individual sanctions and seizing the assets and yachts of Halliburton executives and other politically connected American billionaires, I would have been all for it. If on the other hand, there were sort of indiscriminate sanctions that immiserated working class Americans, I wouldn't have been for it. I certainly wouldn't have been for Russia or China sending troops to fight to fight in Iraq and thus bringing about the end of the world, because I like the world. And so
it's a great world.
Yeah, no, it's A+. It's the best one we have, and I don't want. I would rather there not be a global thermonuclear exchange if we could possibly avoid that.
And I should say, I think that Nathan Robinson's recent article on current affairs, which I think is the one you're mentioning, right, Ben?
Yep. Yeah, I think we actually have a graphic of that, or do we, Jake? Yeah, here we go.
Yeah. No, I think he's exactly right about this. I want to point out that I'm not trying to apologize for Western hypocrisy by suggesting that Putin isn't right and sometimes saying that we've done many of the same things. We have done many of the same things. In some circumstances, we've done worse things, particularly when it comes to the Iraq War. I just don't think that in any way vindicates what he's doing or should preclude us from pointing out that it's an evil thing that needs to be stopped, much like I wish that George Bush went to jail, along with at least a number of those Halliburton CEOs. Definitely Dick Cheney, Although I prefer if like Cheney wound up in Guantanamo Bay or something, just to add layers to the poetic irony. But anyway, yeah, I agree.
For sure, right? Like, and I also think it is possible, even on the left, to go too far in the direction of emphasizing the hypocrisy and actually forget what your own principles are supposed to be, right? Because like hypocrisies can be resolved in different directions, right? Like if you believe two things that are inconsistent with each other, once you realize that leaves open the question of which one you should stop believing, right? So I think it's perfectly fine, for example, to point out that if Mexico at some points was pursuing membership of the Warsaw Pact, there's an excellent chance the United States would have invaded. And I think that's true. And I think that certainly goes to the hypocrisy of many American mainstream politicians. But also, if that had happened, right, like we would all be marching in anti-war protests, quite rightly, right? And I think that and so I certainly have nothing but love and solidarity for Russians who are marching in anti-war protests. But I do want to yank us, if possible, off of this, because there's one last thing I want to do before we go, which is
Could I just add something quick? Sorry.
Quick addendum from Conrad.
Yeah. I just want to say that no, I mean, I think unfortunately, the charge of whataboutism often becomes sort of universal cipher now of the condemnation of geopolitical context, which is the only lens through which you can understand our national affairs. But I do think that with these sanctions, I think that it can be somewhat questionable. On one hand, because I think that there are a lot of Russians who actually oppose this war. It's interesting because a lot of Russians right now are saying we don't support the war, but we support Putin, which is an interesting position. And I would analogize it a bit to the Iraq war, though I think the Iraq war was worse, to be clear. It wasn't a border conflict, also targeted at, protecting speakers of the same language. But I think that, it can be analogized to something like the Iraq war where, the message of a lot of people was like, they're like, I don't really want to go in this war, but once kind of the propaganda machine got kind of going, people were like, well, Bush is sort of our guy, right? There was sort of a resigned attitude that I think a lot of people took toward that. I think the risk with these sanctions is that, you have a nucleus of people who do oppose it. And I think if you look at, a lot of what's going on right now, I mean, not just you talked about the oncology network withdrawing from Russia, like we're going to punish cancer patients, right. But also just the blatant Russophobia. I mean, I know here in Paris, like there's like a Putin store that, has had to issue a clarification on its website because it's being vandalized and receiving harassing calls. In the United States, there are senators talking about expelling all Russian students, from the country. The University of Milan flirted with canceling a course on Dostoevsky. So, I think the risk is that you drive those people towards a nationalistic position, right? Because of that, the exploitation, the ability of the government to exploit sort of rampant Russophobia. And I also think that, if the goal here, I think the subtext of this whole thing is sort of the pivot toward China, right? I don't think Russia is as dependent upon European or American approval as they were in the past for their economic functioning. And I think that, if your goal is to prevent that, I think the reality is that isolating them from a lot of these consortiums and institutions is eligible to only accelerate that pivot. I mean, we saw that very clearly with SWIFT, right? SWIFT is a very fragile system, right? There's China, there's crypto, right? Pretty much as soon as, certain Russian banks were removed from SWIFT, they were already going and plugging the CIPS, which is the Chinese system. So I don't necessarily think this is the right strategy that we're pursuing.
Yeah, no, co-signed, I think, almost all of that. I think that the oncology network is the most disturbing example that you're going to get to punish the cancer patients as a way by somehow indirectly punishing Putin. My favorite fun example is that the International Cat Federation has banned from competition any cats bred in Russia. So if one thing is going to change Russian foreign policy, presumably it'll be that.
Maybe Putin loves cats. You don't know, right? He could just be sitting there like slamming his fist on the table, being like, "I was going to clean up, and now fuck."
Yeah. We're just stabbing in the dark here. They took away his Taekwondo honorary black belt as well, so we're going to see what works,
Yeah, fair enough. Well, speaking of cats, let's read through the rules. So we have the first 12 rules. Jake, do we have the graphic here that has the all right. Rule 1, do not carelessly denigrate Oh no, sorry. These are the new rules, right? This is the okay. So these are the 12 new rules. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. All right. Oh yeah, we had that was the story we went over with Emma Vigeland, where he's illustrating this by talking about his the waiter who he spoke to about this, who was inspired by Peterson's books to stop complaining about his position in life and start getting a bunch of promotions. Do we have the rest of the rules, Jake? All right, that's all right. We can do a screen share so we can get him that way. So let's see.
I hope that waiter soon becomes promoted to being an owner of capital. I hope that happens in his.
Yeah, I would assume it does. All right, here are the original 12. So stand up straight with your shoulders back. Treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. Befriend people who want the best for you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Good luck with that. Set your house in order before you criticize the world. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Assume whoever you are listening to knows something you don't. Does not apply to climate scientists. Be precise in your speech. Do not bother children while they're skateboarding. Okay. And pet a cat when you encounter one in the street. All right, so those are the original 12, and now we have 12 new ones. All right, well, we're looking for the 12 new ones. I guess my hot take on the original 12 is that number 5 is silly. I don't know how you're supposed to prevent your children from doing anything that would make you dislike them. And the one about the cats might be a little, if you have cats at home, that might not be a good idea. You might spread feline diseases. But really, the problem is the setting your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. All right.
Yeah, I think when I wrote my section on the book forever ago, I was living in Mexico at the time, as it feels. I really only had much to say about number 1, mainly because that's where that long tirade about the lobsters and hierarchies was, and then number 6, the whole set your house in order before you criticize the world. And the rest of them were range from innocuous to just kind of dad wisdom,
Fair. All right. Can we get the print a little bit bigger for the 12 new ones? I can't quite read that here.
So these ones are more supposed to be about. My understanding is that the pretext of the new book is that it's supposed to be valorize chaos more, right, as opposed to just valorizing order. That's kind of the idea, right?
It doesn't. I should say.
Yeah, it seemed like when the first one is do not carelessly denigrate social institutions, you kind of wonder how much it lives up to that.
I mean, I read the book, and what kind of I experienced was less a sense of anger, so much as oh, here we go again kind of feeling, because it's more or less the same book. That's supposed to be the kind of thematic underpinning that justifies the sequel, right? We had to go back and talk about the virtues of chaos. Still seems mostly concerned with order, though. So there's really not very much to say about it. If you like the first book, you'll like the second one. If you didn't like the first book, you'll probably find the second one even more boring than the first one.
All right. 1. These are the 12 new rules in Beyond Order. 1. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievements. 2. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. 3. Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Matt, you've read the book. You got to explain 3 to me.
I mean, the general idea behind that one is, again, it's pretty innocuous, that oftentimes, rather than confronting our interpersonal problems, whether in the marriage or in friendship, we try to obfuscate them, or we run away from dealing with them, or we create obscure reasons why we shouldn't be dealing with them. And his argument is essentially don't do that. And then he gives a bunch of different examples of how it is that not dealing with problems in your marriage eventually led to it breaking down for a number of his clients, right? Again, I actually tend to think that that's probably true. Marion could tell you better than I could if I live up to that bit of wisdom. But, again, pretty innocuous.
All right, fair enough. So after that, we have 4, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. 5, do not do what you hate. All right. 6, abandon ideology. That's, I don't know how you're supposed to do that.
Yeah, that was probably the worst. That was the one chapter in the book that did kind of annoy me. In part because for about half a paragraph, and that's half a paragraph, I want to stress, he kind of looks like he's going to be a little bit better, where he says, admittedly, Marx may have made a few points to the effect of da-da-da-da, but, and then he just goes right back on to saying the old thing. And it's really irritating because it's like tantalizingly close to him wanting to say something that's not sophisticated, but halfway sophisticated in text. And then he seems to almost feel himself going there and retreats back away from it. Ironically, in a chapter that's supposed to be about abandoning ideology. So
yeah, I mean, it just seems like, okay, does ideology mean false ideology? In which case, sure, trivially, everybody agrees you should abandon that. Or does it mean like just having a view of the world that colors your assumptions? In which case, again, good luck.
No, he kind of what's interesting about this book, if you follow the history of conservatism like I try to, is it is the one place where he actually lays out his arguments for conservative politics and explicitly names that. And it's more or less what you'd guess, where he says that we shouldn't be too rapid or too radical in trying to transform society. We should accept that a large part of our society functions reasonably well. We can understand that by looking at empirical evidence, also through intuition. And so we should refrain from any kind of transformative actions, right? And ideology is what he associates with that, right? Ideologues are people who want to change things very rapidly for whatever odd reason. Sometimes on the right, but most of his fixations now are obviously on the left, and that's what he's concerned about.
Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't surprise me that much that he offers this sort of, fleeting praise for Marx, because I think that, one of the things that Peterson is capable of doing, which is great for evasion, is that his system is so predicated on this kind of conception of holism, that he's able to, like even in relation to someone like Marx or social democratic movements, he's able to say, well, when things get too unequal, then sometimes there has to be a response, right? Which means that when you're critiquing him, right, you really have to try to pay attention to the statements which he's repeated most emphatically, and are most central to the overall presentation, which I would argue, again, is a sort of vicarious justification of neoliberalism by virtue of an appeal to biological factors. But, it was a thing like when we wrote the book where people would be like, no, but Peterson, you guys get it wrong, because Peterson actually he knows that redistribution needs to happen, right? And it's like, well, yeah, but I don't think that's like the overall theme of his work, right? So it makes it easy to retreat, behind those sort of qualifiers.
I also want to point out that he's not consistent on this point at all, and neither is any other conservative, right? Conservatives will typically say that we shouldn't engage in rapid transformations in society as long as society is more or less abiding by the principles that they themselves tend to prefer, right? When it came to the trucker insurrection against Justin Trudeau, all of a sudden he was talking about a working class revolt against the system and how this was a singular moment in Canadian history. And all of a sudden, right, radical transformation became good. So this kind of conservative axiom generally, and Peterson's particularly, that we should just not try to change things too rapidly, has never been consistently held by anyone. Everyone wants to change things pretty rapidly if they don't like what's going on.
Yeah, I'd be extremely curious about what Peterson's take would be in 1990 about whether the Soviet Union should just incrementally evolve.
Right.
Or like what should happen there, right? Whether like something tells me that he would not have been on the Gorbachev side against Yeltsin on that one. But and by the way, shout out to that chat comment that was highlighted earlier about abandoned ideology. I think the guy says Wade Tables said 12 rules for fish. Number 6, abandon water. 7. Work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. All right. 8, try to make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. I do, sadly, I'm not there right now. That's why I don't have any books behind me. 9, if old memories will still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. Sure. 10, plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. All right. 11, do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. 12, I like that he starts with not denigrating social structures and he ends this way. Be grateful in spite of your suffering.
Yeah. Well, that's an instructive arc, I have to say.
Yeah, no, exactly. All right, guys, this is so much fun. You should. We will include links for all of our guests in the description. The book that we all wrote, most of them, I just wrote a chapter of it, but the book we all wrote is Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, introduction by Slavoj Žižek, big chunks by Matt and Conrad, and then then there's one for Marion, and then there's one for me at the end. So you should go check that out. There is a link in the description for the episode for where you can find that. And yeah, thank you all, especially Conrad, who's got to be. We're getting to be like 3:30 or something where he is. So good job, guys. Let's do this again soon. And I will, Matt and Marion, I will see you guys next month.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it, buddy.
Looking forward to it.
Right.
And yeah, Conrad, metal as fuck, man. doing a YouTube cast at 3:30 in the morning. If Ben had told me that fucking Noam Chomsky and David Harvey were appearing at 3:30 in the morning, and they wanted to ask me questions, I probably would have been like, yeah, sorry. Maybe some other time. So fucking mad solidarity, buddy.
Thanks, guys. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. All right. So that was Matt McManus, Conrad Hamilton, Marion Trejo. Again, the book is Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. Thank you, Todd, for the super chat. Now we're going to see if she has followed Dr. Peterson's advice and tried to make one room in her house as beautiful as possible. But we are joined by the other Dr. Burgis, Jennifer.
Hello.
So
I made my bathroom as beautiful as possible because that's the only room that you don't access. So that's the only one that can stay beautiful.
Fair enough. But I see you have beautified the one you're in, right now in preparation for this.
Yeah.
So I'm in California right now, which is why my background is different, and we're not in the same place. But we, of course, the show must go on, and we have to watch this very enlightening video of Jordan Peterson.
Wait, are you going to play the whole thing?
Let's play part of it. Let's play part of it and see how we feel about it and see how much.
Will there be any audience left? Will there be any audience left when you're done?
So this is Jordan Peterson telling Ben Shapiro about. The title of the video is Jordan Peterson challenges Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Determinism. So we thought it would be good for the philosophy segment. So let's watch a couple minutes. We're doing the screen share, so we can pause at any time that the spirit moves you.
I do want to throw out there that the way that Ben Shapiro is in this is often the way that I am while Ben is talking.
Oh, fair enough. Well, let's get started.
Part of what happens in the New Testament, as far as I can tell, is that what Christ says, so he's trying to transcend the rule structure, right? Not because there's anything wrong with the rules. They're a necessary precondition for discipline, which is actually why I wrote 12 rules, right? It's like you need rules, but rules conflict and they don't always apply. And so there has to be an ethic underlying the rules, and you should have more respect for the ethic than for the rules.
Right.
Okay, Christ's idea, and this is part of the idea of the reestablishment of paradise, is that you should orient yourself towards the good and that's something like an alliance with God, and then that you should tell the truth, and that's the ethic that generated the rules to begin with. Okay, and then we could be serious about this, you know. We could say, well, how do you adjudicate the reality of that claim? All right, so then we might think, well, we already walked through the fact that the heroes of the past acted on potential to extract out the world of actuality. And if they did that properly, then the world they extracted was good, and that is a divine principle. And then we might say, well, is it a divine principle? And you might say,
I just want to leave it as a cliffhanger here for a second. So far we've learned that the heroes of the past extracted actuality from potential.
And Ben Shapiro says,
Yeah, that's probably the way to respond while you're listening to this. Okay. So yeah, if they I believe we just heard that they extracted actuality from potential, and if they did it right, it was good. So let's I think that's correct. Let's keep going.
Say, well, what is it that's acting through people in the good? Like the Christian theological answer to that would be the logos, right? That's the idea. That's the idea of the Holy Spirit, roughly speaking. Right. You might think, well, is that a real thing? It's like, well, to me, it's real the same way that consciousness is real. And we don't know the role of consciousness in determining reality. But even if you're an evolutionary biologist, and this is so interesting because the evolutionary biologists actually differentiated themselves from Darwin on this point. Like Darwin was very, very forthright in his claim that sexual selection was as powerful as natural selection, or even more so. And so here's where that goes. And because that brought consciousness into the world as an active player, the materialistic evolutionary biologists ignored that for like 150 years and only concentrated on natural selection, where they could play, well, this is all chance. Right. It's like, sexual selection is not chance. Okay, so here's a hypothesis. Human beings separated themselves from chimpanzees. One of the reasons they did that was because human females are sexually selective. Chimps aren't. Female chimps in estrus will mate with any chimp. The main chimps, the dominant ones, chase the subordinate males away. So they're more likely to have offspring, but it's not because of female chimps. Right. Now, human females have done this whole different thing, is that they have hidden fertility, and they're much more likely to go after guys who have climbed up the hierarchy. So let's say heroes will give the women some credit for intelligence, right? And say that that's what they're after, even if they're using wealth and so forth and status as a marker. They're actually using those as a marker for competence. Yeah, and I think the evidence. Yeah, I think the evidence for that is clear. Okay, so you might say, oh well, it was human female conscious choice that selected us. Okay, and you think, well, that's not random. That's not random at all. It's the farthest thing from random that there is. And that means consciousness is making its choices with regards to what propagates. But then it's even more complex than that. So here's what happens among men. The men all get together in their hierarchy. They posit a valued goal. They all accept that as the goal, because otherwise they wouldn't be cooperating. Right. Then they arrange themselves into a hierarchy. And they let the most competent guys lead because they want to get to the promised land. They want to get the most competent leaders leading. Right. Competent defined by that value. Okay, so here's what happens essentially. The men all get together and vote on the good men. And the good men are then chosen by the women, and those are the people who propagate. And so it's like men are voting on which men get to reproduce, and women are going along with the vote and being even more stringent in their choices, let's say. And so then what you get is that the consciousness that through its active expression transforms the potential of the world into actuality also selects the direction of evolution. Right, and that's where the meme, Dawkins' term, turns into the biological reality. It's not just, and so this is something that's so cool about Dawkins. It's like, I've often thought this about Dawkins, is if he would push his thinking to the limits, he would fall right into Jung. Well, and then he'd be lost, of course, because that's a whole other universe. But if you take that meme seriously, like, and I mean really seriously, you think, there's some ways of conceptualizing that become so all-encompassing that they hardwire themselves. That's right. They start to become an actual force of evolution itself. And so then here's the case you could make. consciousness extracts the proper world of being from potential through truth, and then it's good. It's like, okay, that's a hard one, man. That manifests itself in human beings at the individual level.
Consciousness extracts actuality from truth.
Ben, I told you that the other day, and you don't pay attention.
Oh, were you just saying it and I was going,
Mostly, there's a cat over here creating chaos.
Yeah. Got to keep the cat of, I think that Jordan Peterson writes about that. Got to keep the cat of chaos at bay. Okay, so
No,
consciousness.
He says that men vote on the top men, and then women choose the top men. Did you notice that?
Yeah, he said the women go along with the vote, except they're more stringent.
No, before that, he said the women choose.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
It's all right. I'm still hung up, and I mean, this is my fault because I really should have been paying attention when you tried to explain this to me yesterday. But I'm really,
I know.
I'm really hung up about how consciousness extracts actuality from truth. So
Look, if you don't understand it, I can't explain it to you.
yeah, fair enough. All right, let's keep going.
Level of individual consciousness. That's the logos within. That's the metaphysical foundation of the idea of natural right and responsibility. Okay, that's a bloody killer idea. That's expressed in the hero of heroes, that idea. That hero of heroes is the driving force behind human evolution. So not only do you get the action of the logos metaphysically as the process that extracts order out of chaos at the beginning of time, you also get it as the major driver of evolution. And so then you ask, okay, then what kind of reality does that have? Because you chase consciousness back, and like it disappears into the mystery of the past, and we have no idea what its relationship is with matter. But it's the force that gives rise to the cosmos and drives evolution. It's like you're getting pretty close to God there.
Yeah.
Even just pragmatically speaking.
And you're certainly, not close to, but in the midst of an argument about free will, because obviously if you make the hard determinist argument that free will doesn't exist and that consciousness is merely a sort of trick that your brain is playing on itself, then how does culture propagate? How do these memes propagate? How are people choosing? Sexual selection and natural selection become one and the same as soon as you boil sexual selection down to natural selection. Right?
Well, and also I think the free will argument.
What are they talking about?
I mean, I see.
Ben, you're muted right now, Ben.
Sorry, I really shed a lot of light on what Peterson was saying, but I'm not sure if I can do it again. Like, I think that might have been a one-time only explanation of exactly how to make sense of Peterson's comment.
Why did you think I was pointing at my ears? Like I'm having some sort of stroke over here?
Yeah, I think maybe. So let me see. So we had Peterson, something sexual selection, something logos, something consciousness, and this
free
is
will.
Pretty close to the existence of God. Well, you guys missed the perfect explanation when I was muted, but this is the best I can do now. And then Shapiro says, well, now we are not just in the close to, but we're in the midst of free will, something, because Because if consciousness is deterministic, how can there be sexual selection?
I don't know.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe it'll get clearer in the last couple minutes. Let's see.
See why Harris gets tangled up in that, because, well, first of all, deterministic arguments are unbelievably powerful. And when we use deterministic models for many things, they really work.
Right.
So you could say, well, we're going to use that by default. It's like, fair enough. We're going to deviate from that with care. But I don't see people as driven like clocks winding down. First of all, we don't wind down in any simple way. We're dissipative structures. To use, he wrote Schrodinger, what is life? A human being is a dissipative structure. We're not an entropic structure like a clock running down. I mean, we are in some sense, but as living beings, we pull energy in. And so we're not winding down like a deterministic structure. We're something other than that. And the way we treat each other is as logos, as far as I can tell. The way I treat myself,
right,
if I'm going to be good to myself in the proper sense, is that I'm an active agent of choice confronting an infinite landscape of potential and casting that potential into a reality for good or for evil.
Right.
Okay. And if I treat myself that way, then I have proper respect for myself and proper fear of myself, because I can make bad decisions and warp the structure of reality. And I think if you read Frankl, for example, or Solzhenitsyn, and you see how your bad decisions can warp the structure of reality, then that wakes you up, right? Okay, so there's that. If you don't treat yourself like an active agent, imbued with logos, then your life doesn't go well. But more, if you don't treat other people that way, they do not want to play with you. If we set up societies that aren't predicated on the idea that people are like that, then the societies they dissolve or they become totalitarian almost instantly. So then I would say, well, you've got the problem of determinism. It's like, fair enough, man. How do you reconcile the fact that if you lay out a society at every level of analysis on strict deterministic grounds, it fails? So doesn't that mean your hypothesis has a flaw? I mean, maybe not. Maybe you can say, no, the facts are independent of the ethical consequences.
Right, exactly. This is where the truth pragmatism question comes back into being, right? Because Sam would say, well, it's true regardless of what the effect is. And you would say, well, it's obviously not true if morals are constructed for a pragmatic reason, and if this pragmatism doesn't work, if it falls into nothingness.
Well, it also depends to some degree on how you're willing to test your hypothesis. Because I might say, well, if your hypothesis is factually correct, wouldn't you assume that if people based their behaviors individually and familial and socially on that set of facts, which is basically what Sam claims about facts to begin with, if you base your ethos on those facts, wouldn't it work?
Right.
Well, he claims that that's a test, and I would say, well, then it fails that test. It doesn't work. We have to treat each other like divine centers of consciousness in order for society to work.
Okay.
I have infinite potential.
Yeah.
That's what I gained from that.
Yeah. Okay. So Heroes extracts actuality from truth, which has something to do with sexual selection, which has something to do with God. Hi, Lucy. And
we got all the Koreans here tonight.
Yeah, for anybody who didn't catch that, the dog and the cat both come from South Korea when we lived there, so hence the Koreans. So there was that whole argument, whatever was going on there, all the stuff that the was a response to, and then what I got at the very end is an argument that I feel like I've gotten from a few intro to philosophy papers over the years. Like I actually, at least understood what was going on at the end, which was, well, if we didn't believe in free will, there'd be bad consequences. Did you get anything different out of that, or what am I missing something really, here?
No.
Okay.
My intro students are too smart to try to make that kind of argument. Either too smart or too well taught, one or the other.
Well, I just show up at half-assed, and so they have a, some of mine do end up saying things like that. I feel like I've gotten a few of those over the years. And then that was actually, I gotta say, I mean, like he said it in Jordan Peterson speak that, that you have to treat each other as divine centers of consciousness and stuff like that. But I think that's what he was saying, that like society can't work if we don't treat each other like we have free will. And
okay,
that's the one thing that I actually felt like I understood in those 9 minutes. And I think that's the only thing Ben Shapiro understood either. And the reason that I think that is that was the only time that he actually responded to what Peterson was saying instead of just going, oh, uh-huh. Uh-huh. Oh, like at the very end with that, he was like, well, okay, but like if can't it still be true? And I understand you're some kind of weird pragmatist about truth, so you don't think that, but still can't something be true even if acknowledging it would have bad consequences? Like that was actually the one point where Shapiro like crawled out and started engaging with the content of what he was saying.
So we watched 8 minutes to get to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny actually, because I think the last time we watched a video of Shapiro and Peterson together, we said that
it's very similar.
It was very similar, but yeah, there's a lot about sexual selection that was somehow or another supposed to tell us something about God, and it was very unclear what the connection was supposed to be. But in that other video, it felt like Shapiro was doing the thing that like a good intro to philosophy instructor would do, where you hear the student just like babble, for a couple minutes. And then you say, okay, so what I'm hearing you say it is, and you translate it into something that's like a coherent thought so you could respond to it. But in this,
that just earlier today.
I'm sure you did. Whereas in this one, it seemed like Shapiro was acting like a just utterly defeated intro to philosophy instructor who just couldn't even come up with a way to translate it into a coherent thought. And so it's just like, oh, uh-huh, 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 okay. So maybe we can talk about
this is where you do, okay, anybody want to respond to Jordan?
Exactly. He's kind of doing the like,
hand this off to y'all.
Okay, well, maybe we can talk about free will now, because you use some words that sort of reminded me of that. So let's do free will. Yeah. Fair enough. So I don't know. Are you convinced that free will is real now?
When I first watched this and Ben sent me the link and I watched it and I said, I have no idea what's happening here. What are they even talking about? And Ben said free will and determinism. And I said, how do you know? Where did you get that? How do you know? Then I watched it again and it was marginally clearer. But no, I have not been convinced of anything except that I have infinite potential.
Okay. Have you?
We should treat each other like we're divine logoses or logi or something.
Okay. And that we extract actuality from reality with consciousness.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'm gonna go do that in the post game now. If y'all
need some real entertainment on our Instagram, I just posted a video of myself lip syncing to a good song, so y'all can go check that out.
Fair enough.
It's way more entertaining than Jordan Peterson.
Well, that's a matter of taste. I find Jordan Peterson pretty entertaining.
Let's last for 9 minutes.
If you do a video of yourself lip syncing to Jordan Peterson explaining sexual selection and the logos and divine centers of consciousness, then I will definitely watch that on repeat.
Y'all should follow us on Instagram at Ben and Jen.
There you go, and Jen will do that. What I just said. So, all right. Well, in the post game for patrons, Nathan Robinson is going to join us to extract some actuality from the reality of things that people have tweeted about Russia and Ukraine. So looking forward to that. And meanwhile, my divine center of consciousness here is going to go back to whatever she was doing with her night. So,
Team Snoopy forever.
Left is best.